How much power does a man need before he finally feels safe? The Oval Office was quiet that morning. Not the ceremonial quiet of photographs and visitors, but the working, quiet curtains half drawn, papers arranged in controlled stacks, sunlight filtered into careful rectangles across the carpet. Outside, Washington moved with its usual confidence. Inside, the President of the United States was listening. A tape recorder hummed softly beneath his desk. Richard Nixon did not trust memory. Memory could be denied. Memory could be disputed. But tape could not. It was the 23rd of June 1972. 6 days earlier, 5 men had been arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The newspapers had treated it as a strange burglary, nothing more than political espionage, perhaps clumsy, perhaps embarrassing, but minor. The election was months away. Nixon was leading comfortably in the polls. He was not in danger, and yet he felt it. 2A, Orant, Haldeman sat across from him. The Chief of Staff spoke calmly, methodically, as if outlining a logistical problem rather than a constitutional one. The FBI investigation was expanding. Money trails, phone numbers, connections that were beginning to point closer, not to the campaign, but to the structure surrounding the presidency itself. There were still options. The CIA could be asked to intervene. National security could be invoked. The Bureau could be redirected. The investigation might stop before it reached anything that mattered. Nixon listened without interruption. He rarely interrupted when he was thinking. He leaned back slightly in his chair. His posture never relaxed, even in private. His shoulders remained squared, as though permanently prepared for argument. He asked a few short questions, not about legality, not about morality, about control. Would it work? How certain was the Bureau? Who already knew? Outside, the presidency appeared immense. The office carried armies, treaties, nuclear authority. But inside that room, power felt fragile. Not weak, fragile, as if it depended not on laws or votes, but on whether unseen forces might suddenly turn against him. He approved the plan. The instruction was indirect, carefully worded, a suggestion rather than an order. The CIA would warn the FBI that the investigation risked exposing sensitive intelligence operations. The Bureau would slow down, perhaps stop. No raised voice, no dramatic declaration, just a decision made in a conversational tone. The tape kept recording. At that moment, nothing visibly changed in the country. The stock market did not react. The public did not panic. Congress did not gather in emergency session. The president continued his schedule. Meetings, briefings, photographs. Yet something had shifted, not in law, but in boundary. Nixon did not see himself committing a crime. He saw himself preventing a political destabilization, an institutional attack, a threat that might spiral beyond the burglary itself. He had spent his life watching opponents, journalists, and rivals reduce complex events into simple accusations. He believed they would do it again. He had learned long ago that politics was not a debate. It was exposure. Years earlier, during the 1950 Senate campaign in California, he had seen reputations destroyed overnight. Allegations could end careers faster than truth could defend them. He had survived by anticipating attacks before they materialized. Power, he believed, did not protect a man. It made him visible, and visibility invited enemies. Even after becoming president, the feeling never left. Demonstrators gathered outside the White House gates. Newspapers printed leaks from within his own administration. Television commentators analyzed his expressions, his pauses, even his silences. The office gave authority, but not security. So he built systems, lists, memoranda, internal investigations, recorded conversations. He wanted to know what others were saying when he was not present. He wanted a record no one could dispute. If accusations came, he would have proof. If betrayal appeared, he would see it first. The taping system was not installed to abuse power. It was installed because he feared losing control of it. In private conversations, he often returned to the same theme. A president could not simply act honorably and expect fairness. He believed his predecessors had been protected by goodwill he never received. He felt judged differently, harsher, quicker, more suspiciously. And suspicion changes behavior. The Watergate break-in to Nixon was not the beginning of a scandal. It was the beginning of exposure. Not exposure of illegal activity, exposure of vulnerability. If investigators continued without limits, every conversation, every political maneuver, every private strategy might become public interpretation. He did not fear prison. He feared helplessness. In the days following that meeting, he spoke publicly about policy, foreign relations, and peace negotiations. He met diplomats. He discussed Vietnam. He planned campaign appearances. Outwardly, the presidency functioned with perfect continuity. Privately, attention narrowed. Who was talking to reporters? Which agencies were loyal? How far would investigators go? The burglary itself had been small. The reaction to it would not be. Because once a leader believes security depends on control, restraint becomes difficult. Each protective action requires another. Each secret demands reinforcement. The boundary between defense and misuse grows indistinct, not suddenly, but gradually. And in that quiet office, with the recorder quietly turning beneath the desk, a president had taken a step he did not recognize as decisive. He believed he was stabilizing the government. He was actually entering a struggle not with his opponents, but with his own fear, a fear that even the highest office in the country could not silence. The crowds outside the White House gates did not sound like crowds to Nixon. From inside the residence at night, with the windows closed and curtains drawn, the chanting blended into a low, distant vibration, not words, just pressure, a reminder that the presidency was not only a position of command, it was a position surrounded. In May 1970, 2 years before Watergate, he had walked alone through quiet hallways, unable to sleep. The Cambodia announcement had ignited protests across the country. Universities shut down, demonstrations spread city to city. Then came the shootings at Kent State, 4 students dead. The nation did not simply disagree with him, it reacted as if the government itself had turned against its people. Nixon watched television coverage late into the night. He rarely admitted uncertainty in public, but privately the scale of anger unsettled him. He did not understand why actions he believed were meant to end a war produced deeper unrest. So before dawn one morning, without planning, he left the White House. The Secret Service scrambled to follow as the presidential limousine drove toward the Lincoln Memorial. Washington was empty at that hour. The marble steps were filled not with tourists, but with student protesters who had been sleeping there overnight. The president approached them. There was no podium, no prepared remarks, just small groups of young people sitting on the stone steps, surprised to see him standing among them. He tried to speak conversationally, about travel, about history, about how difficult leadership could be. The conversation did not go well. Students challenged him directly about the war. Some argued calmly, others laughed nervously. They were not hostile in the violent sense, but they were unconvinced. The office that commanded armies could not command belief. Nixon left after less than an hour. The sun was rising over the reflecting pool as he returned to the car. The visit was barely reported at the time, but it stayed with him. He had come seeking connection and found distance. He concluded something quietly. Persuasion was unreliable. Public opinion could shift quickly. Loyalty could not be assumed. Demonstrations were not just disagreement, they were instability. If a president depended on approval, then he depended on forces he could not control. From then on, control mattered more. He began relying heavily on a small circle of advisors. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, a few others. Information was filtered tightly. Meetings were limited. Access was restricted. He preferred memoranda to open debate. A structured environment felt safer than spontaneous discussion. At the same time, leaks increased. Newspaper stories began appearing that quoted internal deliberations almost immediately after meetings ended. Policy discussions were public before decisions were finalized. To Nixon, this was not routine politics. It was infiltration. In 1971, When classified Pentagon papers detailing the history of the Vietnam War were leaked to the press, the impact was personal. The documents concerned previous administrations, not his. Yet he reacted strongly. If secret government records could be taken and published once, they could be taken again. He authorized the creation of a special investigative unit within the White House. Officially, they were to prevent future leaks. Unofficially, they were to identify enemies, individuals believed to be using information to weaken the presidency. The group would later be known simply as the Plumbers. The name sounded almost harmless. The activities were not. They conducted surveillance. They searched for damaging material on critics. One operation involved breaking into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, hoping to find information that could discredit the man who leaked the Pentagon papers. No public order announced these actions. They existed in memoranda, conversations, and private approvals. Each step felt temporary, corrective, a response to extraordinary circumstances rather than a new normal. But circumstances kept appearing extraordinary. By 1972, the re-election campaign approached. Nixon's diplomatic achievements, opening relations with China, arms talks with the Soviet Union had strengthened his political standing. He was positioned for a decisive victory. Yet, the monitoring continued. The campaign committee wanted intelligence on opponents. Not broad policy strategy, but specific information, plans, messaging, weaknesses. The same logic applied again if rivals were gathering information. The presidency could not afford ignorance. When the men entered the Watergate complex, they carried cameras and recording equipment. The objective was not dramatic sabotage. It was knowledge. The burglary failed. And for a brief moment, Nixon had a choice. He could distance the presidency completely, allow investigators to follow evidence wherever it led. Treat the break-in as a criminal act unrelated to the office. It would have been politically uncomfortable but survivable. Instead, he remembered something he believed deeply. Political damage spreads faster than truth. By the time explanations emerge, reputations collapse. The investigation itself might create a narrative no later correction could erase. So the cover effort began, not loudly, not formally. It moved through conversations, suggestions, payments to defendants to remain silent, and attempts to limit investigative agencies. Each action seemed smaller than the risk it tried to prevent. The logic was always the same: contain the instability before it grows. But containment required secrecy. Secrecy required coordination. Coordination required trust in fewer and fewer people. The presidency, designed as the most public office in the country, was becoming increasingly private. Decisions were shaped not by national debate, but by defensive calculation. The goal was no longer merely to win elections or conduct policy. It was to prevent exposure. And the more protection he built around himself, the more dangerous the truth inside that protection became, because it now included the effort to hide it. By the summer of 1973, the problem was no longer the burglary. It was the questions. Senate hearings began in a crowded chamber where the atmosphere felt less like politics and more like slow examination. Witnesses spoke carefully. Lawyers repeated timelines. Names returned again and again to the same place, the White House. Nixon did not attend. Presidents never did. Instead, he watched from a small room in the executive office building, often alone, the television volume low. The proceedings unfolded hour after hour. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just patient accumulation. Then, on July 16, Alexander Butterfield spoke. His voice was steady, almost reluctant, as he answered a direct question. Yes, there was a recording system in the Oval Office. Conversations were automatically taped. For a moment, the hearings paused. Inside the White House, silence followed. The tapes had been installed for accuracy, for protection, a private archive of presidential decision-making. Now they were evidence. Immediately, the investigation changed. It no longer depended on memory, testimony, or interpretation. It depended on sound preserved, mechanical, unaltered. Nixon understood what that meant. He did not panic. Those who worked around him often noted this. Under pressure, he grew more controlled, not less. He reviewed legal options. Executive privilege. Separation of powers. The presidency, he believed, required confidentiality to function. Advisors must speak freely. National security demanded privacy. He refused to surrender the recordings. The dispute moved into the courts. Subpoenas were issued. Appeals followed. Public opinion began shifting. Newspapers printed transcripts of testimony daily. The hearings played on television across the country, not as breaking news but as routine viewing, part of everyday life. For the first time, Americans were watching the presidency investigated in real time. Nixon continued working. He held diplomatic meetings. He addressed foreign leaders. Official duties proceeded almost unchanged. Yet, each day added pressure, not sudden, but steady the pressure of inevitability. He ordered edited transcripts released instead of the tapes. The documents were precise but incomplete. Key sections marked inaudible. Others summarized rather than quoted. The intention was compromise. Provide information while preserving authority. It convinced almost no one. The issue had become larger than the burglary, larger even than Nixon himself. The question was now whether the presidency could place itself beyond examination. In April 1974, the House Judiciary Committee began formal impeachment proceedings. The legal language was careful: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress. Not accusations of personal corruption alone, but misuse of the office. Privately, his circle had shrunk dramatically. Many advisors had resigned. Some faced charges. Conversations in the residence grew shorter. Meetings became procedural. The presidency, once filled with visitors and negotiation, felt quiet again. But this quiet was different from the controlled quiet of earlier years. It was the quiet of narrowing options. Then came the Supreme Court decision. United States v. Nixon. The ruling was unanimous. The court acknowledged executive privilege but declared it limited. The tapes must be released. No office, even the presidency, stood entirely outside judicial process. There was no appeal. When the recordings were delivered, one conversation drew immediate attention. The 23rd of June, 1972. The same meeting, 6 days after the burglary. The discussion about directing the CIA to restrain the FBI investigation. It became known as the smoking gun. The effect was immediate. Congressional support collapsed. Members of his own party informed him conviction in the Senate was certain. For the first time, the calculation changed. Remaining in office would not preserve authority. It would destroy the institution he believed he was protecting. On the evening of the 8th of August, 1974, he addressed the nation from behind a desk he had fought to control for years. His voice was steady, though slower than usual. He announced he would resign the presidency effective the next day. No dramatic confession, no detailed defense. He spoke of responsibility, of national interest, of avoiding prolonged division. He said a president must have the support of Congress to govern, and that support was gone. The next morning, he walked across the South Lawn toward a waiting helicopter. Staff members lined the path. Some applauded softly. Others stood still. At the top of the steps, he turned, raised both arms briefly in a familiar gesture, and entered the aircraft. The helicopter lifted slowly above the White House grounds. For the first time in his political life, the office was no longer around him. He had reached the highest power available in his country. And in the end, the system he tried to secure had held not because trust existed, but because limits did.